here's a recap of the latest developments in Ukraine. Russia says it hit a total of 300 targets across the country overnight. They included the city of Lviv, which is located near the Polish border. 7 residents were killed and 11 others were wounded in the strikes, which were centered near the city's train station. Meanwhile, the battle for Mariupol continues. A few hundred Ukrainian fighters are holding out there. Now, business news. The EU lodges allegations of embezzlement, and the accused isn't a Russian national, but a French presidential hopeful, Marine Le Pen. Meanwhile, China's economy grows more quickly than expected in the first quarter. But can we trust the numbers? Well, here to discuss the day's business news is Arise correspondent Laurie Laird. Always good to see you, Laurie. Let's start with Madame Le Pen. Being investigated for corruption by the EU. Tell us more.
And this came out in very obscure ways. We've learned that the EU has sent a report to the French government over the past couple of days. We've learned this from an investigated website in France called Mediapart. They're not, say, as well known as Bellingcat, which is doing the same sort of thing in Russia, but they are uncovering things that are sort of under the radar screen. The French authorities have said that they are looking at the report, so no sense of whether they're going to take this further. But we put this in perspective a little bit. Marine Le Pen has been under investigation from the EU for similar situations over her career. She was a member of the European Parliament from 2004 to 2017. That's where she first sort of came to light. And the accusations are not that she profited personally from these EU funds, but that she may have used these funds for party political purposes.
And is the timing of this probe purely coincidental, given the sort of upcoming runoff against Emmanuel Macron?
Look, it's difficult not to raise eyebrows about this, isn't it? We're just a couple of days from the runoff in the presidential election. We have had a number of EU leaders say, wait a second, we can't work with Madame Le Pen. She is against everything that the EU is about. She has backed off her desire to take France out of the EU, take it out of the common currency, but she still wants to impose border controls that go against EU law. So nobody in the EU, save perhaps autocrats like Viktor Orban in Hungary, no one else is particularly happy to see her in the running to be the French president.
Now, you mentioned the EU and the currency. I've been dying to ask you if Madame Le Pen is still Madame Frexit. I heard somebody say that. I had to use it. Well, that's no longer part of her plan, because I've also heard it said that she now wants a sort of a la carte EU membership. That
is a better description, Charles. She's backed off of Frexit, and perhaps a lot of people in France have looked at how the UK has perhaps not prospered outside of the EU and thought maybe coming out of the EU isn't such a great idea. The UK certainly hasn't made it work yet. But what she has proposed, which is scary to a lot of European leaders, is things that come outside of the EU law, certain tax breaks, certain support for industry, control of France's borders. This would go completely against EU law, would be a mess to try and get through an EU that is really rather divided. We've seen the EU come together because of Ukraine, but we still have Hungary and Poland really breaking a lot of EU rules. The thought is that they will make common cause with Le Pen, could be a real thorn in the side for the sort of conventional wisdom of the EU.
And briefly, she used to advocate leaving the euro single currency. Is that still the case?
Not still the case at all. Again, she's backed off those more contentious things, and she's picking up things that are popular, particularly take control of our borders. I mean, so we're looking at so many countries in the EU where that is a rallying cry.
Right, let's turn to China and the latest economic figures suggesting that growth was stronger at the start of the year than forecast. What's your analysis of that?
Look, growth was much stronger than forecast. We're looking at a year-on-year growth rate of 4.8%. Most economists were looking for something like 4.4% or even lower. On a quarter-to-quarter basis, which is how we talk about GDP here in Europe, up 1.3%. It's pretty perky growth, and Charles, it's so difficult to make these numbers add up. Consumer spending was very, very weak in the third month of the quarter. In March, fell by more than than 3%. A lot of that has to do with these lockdowns, but when consumer spending is that weak, it's hard to see how your broader economy is going to grow. What seemed to rescue things was a big rise in industrial production, 5% year on year, but cement production down 6%, steel production down 12%. How do you get these two big products that China produces a lot of? These are down so much. How you can aggregate the rest of the economy and say it was up by such a large amount, difficult. These numbers don't seem to really add up. Some vagaries as well with fixed asset investment. That's essentially building houses, up 10% year on year. Yet we know that housing starts for apartment buildings were down 20%. So how do you add these things up? Doesn't make any sense.
I'm talking about adding things up. According to China's National Bureau of Statistics, I suppose consumer spending is related to retail sales, that in March dropped more sharply than expected. I mean, how should we read that?
The biggest drop that we've seen since the depths of the pandemic in March and April of 2020. So this was a real surprise. And keep in mind that in much of March, people were behind closed doors. Places in population centers like Shanghai couldn't leave their houses. This will become a lot more apparent in April, but it certainly started in March. Now, these retail sales numbers that you spoke of don't cover all of consumer spending. Consumer spending also takes in holidays when people go to restaurants. But we know at least in Shanghai, a city of 25 million people, no one was doing much of that in the month of March, weren't doing it in the month of April. And lots of economists, it's not just me that is doubting this, lots of economists are actually saying there could be a recession in China come the middle of the year.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because as these figures were coming out, the Chinese authorities were saying that domestic and international uncertainties are increasing. What does this mean?
It means that they are making an excuse for not meeting their growth forecasts, and the Chinese government has set a growth forecast of 5.5% for the full year. Chinese growth has a funny old way of meeting the government's growth forecast. It's usually in line. So that makes a lot of people think, gosh, maybe we can't trust these figures. And again, look at these figures. Where are we? Mid-April. We already have first quarter numbers for China. In most countries, it takes a lot longer to compile these things. But I think a lot of people are looking for the Chinese government to do something. Today, the central bank said, we've got it under control. There will be measures to help people. This will probably take the form of an interest rate cut sooner rather than later.
Right, let's turn to Sri Lanka, grappling with its most severe economic crisis since independence more than 70 years ago, and beginning talks with the IMF about a multi-billion-dollar loan to help pay for imports of food, fuel and medicines. Tell us more about
Charles,
that.
not before time. Anyone who looks at Sri Lanka, anyone who looks at developing world economies knew that they were going to have to go to the IMF. And the question was, why on earth did this take so long? Sri Lanka won't be the last country to go to the IMF, but like unhappy families, unhappy economies are all sort of dysfunctional in different ways. There are some unique things about Sri Lanka. The government that's in place right now cut taxes inexplicably in 2019, just as the pandemic hit, devastated its tourist industry. Sri Lanka had no real funds coming in. It's so reliant on tourism, and particularly from tourists from Russia and Ukraine. So this was always an economy that was going to need some help. They're looking for about $3 billion immediately, and that's just to cover what you mentioned. Food, fuel, medicines, these essential items that the country is going without. As for how it gets itself on its feet, it's going to need a lot more than that $3 billion. The problem that so many countries have found, particularly African countries, is when you take money from the IMF, you've got to do what the IMF says. You've got to cut spending. You've got to produce credible budget plans. You have to produce a way of restructuring your debt. And a lot of countries are reluctant to do that.
And of course, shortages of supplies have prompted expectedly, a wave of protests across Sri Lanka, haven't there? Are people still out there on the streets?
They are, and there have been rumors going around today that the police will be called in to really stomp down on these protests. So we'll see whether that materializes. But I think one other lesson from Sri Lanka, and it could become a model, Charles, is that about 10% of Sri Lanka's debt is given to the Chinese. Now, the Chinese don't tend to work together with groups of creditors to try and work out a debt restructuring program. This is the case in Africa, only to more of an extent. China has extended so many loans to Africa. We don't know what the collateral is. If any African countries get into trouble as well, how the Chinese participates in these debt restructuring costs will be, Sri Lanka could provide the test case.
Well, let's talk briefly about Elon Musk before we go. He's come up with a tweet that nobody can quite understand.
The story that just keeps giving this one, isn't it? He tweeted over the weekend, "Love me tender." Now, has he become an Elvis Presley fan, or does that tender refer to his intentions to offer another bid for Twitter that hopefully in his terms, appeal to all of the shareholders? And so the markets are wondering about this. Twitter shares are up quite a bit today. The U.S. market's one of the few that is trading today. Lots of reporting over the weekend that maybe Elon Musk won't do this himself. Maybe he'll join with a private equity company. Maybe he'll join with a guy called Larry Ellison, who runs Oracle, a big software company, who's also on the Twitter board. But it doesn't look like Elon Musk is giving this up at the moment.
Laurie, sterling analysis as always. Laurie Laird, Arise business correspondent there.